Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome to the Year in SAF, where our expert panel will be exploring what 2025 taught us and where the industry is heading next. Thank you all for joining us today. My name's Roz. I'm a senior conference producer at Sustainable Aviation Futures. And Sustainable Aviation Futures hosts a global series of high-level SAF and aviation decarbonisation conferences, bringing together the entire value chain to network, connect, and discuss capabilities for scaling innovative energy solutions and powering a thriving aviation industry. Over the next 60 minutes, our panel will discuss the SAF market around the world, different funding mechanisms, financing announcements and investor models, the impact of different policies from mandates to incentives, the global project landscape and lessons learned from projects in development, and novel technologies and pathways as routes to reduce cost and carbon intensity. If you'd like to keep abreast of all of our upcoming events, as well as gain access to exclusive interviews and articles, be sure to subscribe to our monthly newsletter, SAF Spotlight. The last edition will be sent a week today, so Tuesday the 16th, and it will feature the first edition of the SAF Market Movers Guide. If you'd like to learn more about speaking, sponsoring, or attending any of our events or digital options, please contact one of the team. And finally, before I hand over to today's moderator, just a couple of bits of housekeeping. The session is being recorded and will be distributed to you within a couple of days after the webinar finishes. And also there's a Q&A at the bottom of your screen, so please ask any questions you have and we'll try to get to them. It's going to be a full discussion, but if there's any time, we will get to some of the questions. And with that, I'm pleased to hand over to today's brilliant moderator, Helen Giles, the Director of Sustainable Aviation at ACF. So Helen, over to you.
Thank you, Roz. Good morning, good afternoon from wherever you're joining today. I'm thrilled to be moderating today's panel. We've got a really incredible lineup of panelists who are leaders that are helping to shape the SAF market from four very different vantage points. We've got policy, airlines, defense, and corporate travel. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists today. Alex Kaiser, Executive Vice President at EFI Foundation, Jonathan Council, Chief Sustainability Officer at IAG, Kevin Billings, Global Lead at the Global Air Force's Climate Change Collaboration, and Nora Lavelle-Marchant, Vice President of Global Sustainability at AMX Global Business Travel. Today, we're going to be moving through three lenses. We're going to first talk about the state of the SAF market, then some policy turning points, and finally, a little bit of a reality check on technology and feedstocks. So with that, let's jump in with the state of the global SAF market. Alex, I'd like to begin with you for more of a macro perspective. Given how volatile 2025 was for energy and policy, what do you see as being the strongest levers for scaling SAF, and where might the industry be a little overly optimistic at the moment?
Thanks, Helen, and thanks everybody for having me. Very excited to continue this discussion with you all. At EFI, we spend most of our time designing new policies to activate private investment. So this question of what is the state of the market and what are the levers that we need is something that we spend, again, most of our time on. We've all heard about the chicken and egg. I prefer the term supply-demand stalemate. I think the SAF industry is at a really important point. We're seeing these low carbon markets slowly materialize, but in different ways across different countries and regions. And what we're seeing is the problem that needs further definition is, as the world needs energy and the world needs to reduce emissions, what are the first steps? What we're very much focused on are the things, let's say the policies that are at least as attractive to the buyers as they are to the sellers. That's how we define demand side policy. And a lot of this stuff, as we're seeing, what's going on in Europe and UK and even across Asia, we're seeing differences in approaches and differences in definitions. But these early steps to get the market going, it doesn't have to be mandates, but we're also seeing some incentives, especially in the United States. The fact that they're unfolding at different paces and different scales is interesting, but what we really need is additional alignment. And we think a lot of that alignment can come from the consumer side. And this is where we spend a lot of our time also, is what kinds of tools are needed to spur that alignment. And something I'm going to be talking about today is carbon accounting. something that we need to make sure that all the emissions get counted in only once is what a lot of the policies, especially the demand side policies, need to create that consistency and accuracy and trust that we require to get more investment flowing into this space.
Thanks, Alex. Well, Jonathan, you're living this within the world's largest SAF portfolio. I know ING has a substantial SAF ambition, and getting to 2030 is going to require some pretty rapid acceleration. Looking at your portfolio, what were some of your biggest bottlenecks in 2025?
Yeah, no, thanks, Helen. It's great to be able to join you today. Yeah, and just so those that may not know IAG, yeah, we're 5 airlines, so British Airways, Iberia, Aer Lingus, Vueling, and Level. Yeah, and we're a hard to abate sector, but so we need everything. But it's clear to us that SAF is going to play probably the primary role in helping us reach net zero emissions by 2050. So yeah, it's good to see that we've been working on SAF for about 10 years or so. Sorry, is that some background noise there, but I'll carry on, yeah. And so it's great to see we actually got SAF being supplied at the moment. Last year, globally, it's about 1 million tons of SAF. This year, we expect 2 million tons. And by 2030, we expect 15 million tons. So we're on the way, largely driven, as Alex was saying, by the EU and UK mandates, which they're fine, but there have been some unintended consequences, and also mandates are very strong views. Mandates on their own don't necessarily deliver you the SAF industry you need. And I think just in terms of some of those unintended consequences, IATA produced two very helpful communiques to the EU and UK regulators looking at what is happening in the market. And it's quite clear that there's been some quite high charging on SAF prices into the market. I think into the EU, they're 50% over market. Into the UK, they're 70% over market. So there's something happening there that was, that wasn't expected. And we hope the regulators will take a closer look at that. But today it's all 1G SAF. We talk about the 3 types of SAF. 1G, which is used cooking oil, fats, oils, and greases. No problem with supply there at the moment. There's good enough volume certainly to meet mandate requirements for the next few years. But we know that 1G SAF will be feedstock constrained, and so we'll cap out sometime in the early 2030s, which is why we need to incentivize 2G and 3G SAF, these more advanced SAF, and that's why we do support the construction within both the UK and EU mandates to signal support for these more advanced SAFs. But there are some challenges there. Maybe we can get into that when we talk, specifically about some of the policy areas.
Oh, thanks, Jonathan. It's definitely a really complex environment. And speaking of some of that, customer demand that's helping to scale SAF as well, Nora, I'd love to switch to you. In 2025, we saw a pretty big expansion of the corporate SAF market, including Avilia becoming a multi-supplier platform. I'd love to hear your thoughts on what you've learned about corporate demand in 2025 and what it's actually going to take to scale Book and Claim.
Absolutely. So thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. 2025 was an interesting year. We've seen increased demand for SAF from corporations, airlines, and the entire aviation value chain. That said, just given some of the politics around this, there's been, I'd say, less press releases in this regard, which is actually okay, because ultimately policy transcends politics. And what we're seeing today, for example, in the United States, is a reintroduction into Congress of a bill fully restoring the total value of the SAF tax incentives, the renewable fuels incentive tax credit under 45Z through 2033. So if there's anyone that has representation in public affairs, government affairs organization in your company or organization, please reach out and contact your representatives and tell them that this is really important, because these tax incentives drive the entire market forward, regardless of where you are in the world. So this is a hugely positive development. Just to be clear, SAF, particularly in the United States, has transcended politics as well. This has been supported under the Biden administration and then included in the One Big Beautiful Bill under the Trump administration. So this is a bipartisan, administration agnostic initiative. So if everyone could just be clear on that, and the opportunity ahead is to grow this market through incentives, through mandates, and as my co-panelist said, through clear policy. And that will trickle down to the airlines, to the corporations who continue to buy SAF, but want that SAF to be, the market to be more clear, the pricing to come down eventually over time. And the policy environment is critical for all of the players in the value chain. So it's been an interesting year, but I think that things are going the right direction, certainly in the United States and also globally. If you look at Singapore, for example, this levy is a new and interesting way to do things, and we'll see what is successful.
Thanks, Nora. There was some uncertainty in 2025, but you're right. It's been great to see SAF become more of a bipartisan topic in the States. And part of that, actually, Kevin, turning to you, you're in a sector that has some really distinct needs in defense. I think we saw in 2025 that SAF plays a key role in energy security and resilience. So, Kevin, we'd love to hear from you. What lessons did you draw from SAF's strategic value kind of beyond just emissions? And what are those implications from a military adoption perspective? And Kevin, you're on mute.
The biggest thing that we have seen with SAF and from a Royal Air Force point of view is the fact that we can and are using it in all of our aircraft, and we've made a commitment to do that. And we're buying SAF at the same rate as the airlines in the UK and going forward with that. But what the SAF is doing for us is it is making our capability more resilient, and that's the biggest issue and the biggest thing that we have going for it in terms of and why we're so keen to incorporate it into our fuel mix and to incorporate it further is because it is a more dense fuel than fossil petroleum that we're putting into our planes, and that allows us even a few extra minutes on target is a lot of time, especially when you think that kill chains are getting shrunk to milliseconds, and the extra time that you're able to spend on target in a hostile environment using the same amount of fuel gives you more resilience and more lethality. So it's a big piece of the puzzle as we look forward to that. And as we look into the future in 10, 20 years, as we deal with the tyranny of distance and moving fuels around, the ability to have it SAF made in more places and shrinking the logistics chain of how fuel gets to the front is a big piece of the puzzle. So SAF plays a role in the strategic future of global defense, and especially not only in the United Kingdom and with the Royal Air Force, but air forces around the world. We'll be meeting in Doha with our deputy air chiefs in February to actually look at a SAF, not a requirement, but our ability to be interchangeable across air forces around the world with different SAF blends and putting that into a document that the air forces will be able to look to and be more interoperable, so we can plug and play when we need to as interoperable air forces.
Thanks, Kevin. I definitely learned some more about more applications for SAF and different implications. Now let's kind of shift from what's happened to what's going to be shaping the year ahead. Policy definitely defined 2025. I know Nora talked a lot about the updates to the 45Z tax credit, and Jonathan shared a little bit about the implementation of those SAF mandates. So what does this mean for 2026? Alex, I'd like to come back to you. From your policy analysis work, what tools do you feel have been really underleveraged, and what should governments and investors be prioritizing for 2026 to help accelerate SAF deployment?
Yeah, I think this is the question, and probably maybe surprising to some coming from a policy angle. it's really going to be the industry. And there's nothing better for policymakers than when industry becomes aligned on a solution. And we see a lot of examples historically in mostly environmental regulations, but things like CFCs or desulfurization of marine fuel or diesel fuel, both. Some of those have a global reach, and like CFCs were deployed in millions of devices globally. But industry and government came together, and then were able to, within 2 decades, completely eradicate CFCs from global supply chains. Similar things have happened in the rapid desulfurization of bunker fuels, which are really negatively affecting ports. And it was a public-private partnership that looked at technology-neutral pathways, set a target, and then got to work and reduce sulfur in marine fuel by 80%, I think, within a decade. And so those are important demand side lessons that I think the aviation sector really should be adopting. I mean, it's going to be right now mentioning these different regulations by different regions is a good thing, and they are, but things get really tough when you start to see various regulations by market, especially among the largest markets. We've seen this in hydrogen, we've seen this, growing in other sectors, and we need that kind of alignment. And I think it's going to be industry led. And that's where I think I'd like to see, and I would encourage the sector to be more aggressive on first aligning on what those tech neutral approaches should be, what those, sensible targets, science-based targets should be, and then working with policymakers on both setting those and then really trying to force alignment across markets. And it doesn't mean industry will do this, but as a first mover, especially with all the policy uncertainty, especially in the United States, is going to be really important. But any of these administrations and governments, I think, will want to make sure that large global reach, global supply chain companies and industries like this one will be, I think, willing to deal on the basis of creating more economic efficiency and how that affects the final consumer. Because right now it's like paying a little bit more for SAF is a competitive disadvantage, and you don't want to hurt first movers. But over time, as you're selling into these different markets, and obviously the airlines are operating in these different spaces, it becomes a really difficult policy sort of rationalization. What do you dial your mix to? And obviously there's a fuel availability question, but as a demand person, I'm telling you, if the industry and the buyers align on what they want, the supply comes. Usually the build it, they will come doesn't work from a supply side standpoint, but it usually does work from a demand side standpoint.
Well, thanks, Alex. I mean, alignment's probably not the word I would use to describe the policy landscape, but we're definitely seeing a patchwork of policy approaches in the States alone, right? And I think, hopeful as well that the industry can continue to advocate for that alignment. Jonathan, I mean, you spoke about some of the challenges with the UK and EU mandates, with SAF coming in much higher than, market prices. How do you see that impacting competition in the industry? And how might that impact IAG's SAF procurement strategy in 2026?
Yeah, well, I mean, it is absolutely so. Mandates, we accept that they create demand, but you have to have those incentives as well, because the cost of these SAFs can be between 3 and 5 times the price of jet fuel. The benefit of us operating across a number of countries, we can see the pros and cons of the EU versus the UK mandates. We're able to share what we think is working here and what is working over in Europe, and they're trying from that harmonize around a better solution. So, in the EU we have the ETS credits, and the EU, they recycle some of the money that aviation puts into the EU emissions trading scheme to support SAF projects. So the SAF allowances, for example, so they provided 20 million SAF allowances to help reduce that price gap between jet and SAF. And last year, I think they allocated about 1.3 million of those. So that's helpful. We definitely advocate for extending that and increasing that because those are going to run out quite quickly in the near term. We don't have those in the UK. So we see a big opportunity with the linkage of the UK and EU emissions trading scheme, that alongside that, the UK also looks at introducing some SAF allowances program, and also recycle some of that ETS revenue, which it doesn't do today. So that acting as support to the industry. The thing that we're looking at here in the UK is the revenue certainty mechanism. So this is something that we've advocated for a number of years. This is essentially, it's a contracts for difference type tool that helps provide revenue certainty for investors. So the UK government have been working very hard on that alongside industry. It's not due to get in place until fourth quarter of next year. And we're pretty clear that no 2G SAF company is going to hit financial close until that policy gets in place. So we're absolutely pushing to get that in place as quickly as possible. And that will then enable some 2G capacity to get implemented here in the UK, help meet the what we have designed, the HEFA cap as part of the UK mandate, which is quite ambitious. So by 2030, we're going to need about 350,000 tonnes of non-HEFA SAF to help meet the UK mandate. So it's getting quite tight. I think with the EU, our biggest point of nervousness is the power to liquid sub-target. We support power to liquids. These are third generation SAF where you take CO2 from the atmosphere mixed with green hydrogen. But the 1.2% sub-target in 2030 requires 600,000 tonnes a year of PTL. Today, there is none. So we are getting quite, and the buyout price on that is very significant. So the EU recently launched a Sustainability Transport Investment Plan, really largely around incentivizing investment in power to liquid plants. We're watching very closely to see if that is having an effect. If that doesn't, then I think there needs to be a bit of a rethink about that eSAF sub-target.
Oh, thanks, Jonathan. I mean, it's a very complex policy landscape and balancing the dynamic of how these policies interact with each other. And it will be really interesting to see how the revenue certainty mechanism does impact that supply and hopefully bring the financing that a lot of these projects, particularly the next gen ones, need. By contrast, the US market is still entirely voluntary. So those demand signals, they're incredibly important. Nora, from Amex GBT's perspective, what is going to be that tipping point that moves SAF from being kind of that nice to have add-on today to being a standard part of travel procurement?
Yeah, Helen, thanks for the question. Unfortunately, we've lost Kevin, but from a military perspective, obviously, the Air Force and military governments around the world need physical SAF to power their airplanes. However, in the voluntary space, book and claim as a globally recognized and standardized and acceptable mechanism for SAF procurement, I think will be the true unlock and helping the industry scale further and faster. So, we've done a lot in the book and claim space together with industry partners. So, for example, we're part of the Avilia book and claim program, but there's lots of different initiatives out there. And so long as they are done in a credible manner, that really is the pathway for scaling SAF on a global basis. Book and claim is currently recognized under the Science Based Target Initiative Aviation Sector Guidance that was published back in April of 2021. So there's a lot of analysis, and the SBTI consultation is actually due December 8th for the next version of the corporate net zero standard. So I would encourage every single individual and company on this call to please submit your feedback to SBTI, which is due December 8th. And please resurface the April 2021 guidance that clearly and unequivocally indicates that book and claim is an acceptable mechanism for achieving science-based targets for corporations and for airlines alike. This is really important because aviation is actually a uniquely concentrated industry. You have the top two engine manufacturers accounting for 75% of the market, the top two aircraft manufacturers accounting for 90% of the market. And here's the hook for book and claim. You have top 25 airlines account for almost half of global volume, and you have the top 25 airports accounting for half of revenue passenger kilometers and therefore emissions. And that's what's really important. Kevin, for example, from a military perspective, needs physical SAF in his airplanes, right? But for the rest of us, if you address those concentrated airlines, those concentrated airports that are as close as possible to the production facility, that means the lowest carbon fuel, keep low carbon fuels local. And that's the way that we can decarbonize the aviation industry in the lowest carbon, most economically efficient manner. So that was a long-winded way of saying, Helen, I think that booking claim is the answer. There's already incredible progress that's been done, and we have to continue on that journey.
Completely agree, Nora. And thanks to you as well for all your work pushing that forward and advocating for the industry. Still a lot of work to be done, but a lot of progress has been made. I think, we talked a lot about the market, sort of what's happening right now, where policy is taking us. And Jonathan had touched on this a little bit, but the next big question is, can the supply side actually keep up? So Alex, between the feedstock constraints and high production costs, how do you assess balancing scaling the HEFA SAF of today very quickly versus investing in those next gen technologies that will be needed in the long term? And Alex, sorry.
Yeah, sorry about that. I said this is always the question. It always takes both. I think from a bigger picture point of view, we are strong proponents of whatever we can do to bend the emissions curve today while investing in potential breakthroughs. And so some of those actions today are technological. A lot of them are, related to project development. And there's innovations that need to happen there, but it's not the same concept of innovation people normally think about. So we need those large investment, big bets on big breakthrough technologies. That's the only way we are able to see these things materialize over time, especially as we increasingly need them. But there's a lot on the ground that has to get done right now. And I think booking claim is a great example of, I wouldn't say it's the solution, but I would say that it is a terrific immediate term action we need to take to send the right signals to get the market better and better oriented. And one of those things where we think that orientation really needs to affect is what I mentioned at the beginning, and people usually roll their eyes when I talk about it, but it's carbon accounting. So right now, all these systems rely on various types of inputs into, counting up the emissions across the value chain or supply chain. We just need, I think, to upgrade our language for how we talk about it. And one of the things that at our organization we spend a lot of time on is what is the common language that companies and people, transact on today, and that's financial. And looking at that, what we can learn from financial accounting and apply to how we drive the inputs into carbon markets, we think is so important. That is not to say upend how we currently do things, but how to further converge on the transactions that we want to continue to make in compulsory markets and in voluntary markets, things that are regulated as well as incentivized. And this just has to do with, count all emissions only once, have something that is more like a financial accounting based ledger that, companies can manage internally on the basis of each transaction and just cover the emissions that they are in direct control over. And the logic of the case is if every company maintained their gate-to-gate emissions, you would have and you added up all those ledgers, you would have all of the emissions in the economy. That's so important just because we're going to get, low-hanging fruit plus as we go through, except for where the mandates are ramping up. We're going to get companies taking, that are more aggressive or not around acting voluntarily. What we want is like a common language so we can really understand where the emissions are coming from and then create those real investment signals and say, if you invest here, then the emissions reduction will be recognized across all transactions that you are to undertake. And so it feels maybe more like a soft power maneuver, but it's so important to like one of these kind of near and longer term investments that we need to keep making so that the sector can truly scale. And I think increasing the certainty around what we're investing in is going to be so important. So then that gets back to your point around we really got to do a lot of things today to deploy what we can to bend the curve, things like book and claim. We also do have to continue to invest and I think ramp up investment in the innovation space, especially in the United States, but elsewhere. That does bring us also full circle to demand side because the United States, we're kind of at risk of ceding energy leadership to other countries in the innovation space for a lot of reasons. Some of it has to do with the current policy environment, but I would argue that it's actually going back a decade plus to the United States being, I would say, overly reliant on supply side incentives and not, taking seriously more of these market formation maneuvers. And it doesn't mean it has to be a Chinese style industrial policy, but it's back to public-private partnerships that work on setting kind of the strategic direction of a sector or an industry, together. I mentioned those few examples on desulfurizing marine fuel or CFCs or desulfurizing diesel fuel. These things, would seemingly be very unappetizing to the industry, but when there was this like strategic objective and you create a level playing field for companies, I think I'll let my colleagues on the call speak to this. I think there's willingness to act and compete. It's just making sure there's a level playing field, and that takes a lot of things, including that carbon accounting style regime that I mentioned before.
No, absolutely, Alex. I mean, definitely would add credibility to have a more commonality, between the carbon accounting languages, and there are different models out there, but also optimistic that we'll eventually get there. So Nora, coming back to you, as more and more corporate customers begin to ask for SAF, in their travel programs, I'm sure the topic of, HEFA is not going to be enough to meet long-term demand, could be coming up. And what models are you kind of seeing corporate buyers explore to help bring next-gen SAF to the market?
Yeah, I mean, an overly simplistic answer. We divide our SAF strategy into SAF today and SAF tomorrow. So SAF today is clear. It's HEFA-based SAF. That is the only type of SAF that is commercially available. And everyone that has a science-based or net zero target from a voluntary perspective can and should purchase HEFA-based SAF effective immediately. So that is clear. In order to scale the second and third generation technologies mentioned by Jonathan, for example, we need, technical advancements. I wouldn't say technical breakthroughs, just technical advancements. We need those startups to increase their technology readiness level and scale up their operations and lower their price point. And there's various ways that can be done. We, for example, have invested in the United Ventures Sustainable Flight Fund, and there are similar ventures funds that are launching all of the time to help scale these, next generation technologies. And I would encourage everyone and anyone to invest in those future technologies so that we can help decarbonize this industry collectively faster.
Yeah. Well, thank you for setting a strong demand signal on that front. Jonathan, moving to you, IAG has spent $3.5 billion on SAF offtake so far as of 2024.
Indeed.
And as technologies and sustainability criteria evolve, how are you building flexibility into your long-term procurement and investment decisions to mitigate your exposure to changes in policy? For example, around the PTL mandate that you mentioned.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And maybe if I talk about, I think, the key role that airlines can play in help stimulating a SAF market is through these long-term committed take-or-pay contracts. And that's what we've been doing. So that $3.5 billion really is an aggregation of the value of all of those SAF contracts that we've put in place. So for instance, with 12, the Patalip company in the US, that was a 14-year contract. And then more recently with Infinium, that's a 10-year contract. So, we encourage more airlines to do the same because those contracts will enable those SAF companies to go and raise capital in the markets and get funding. So we see that as an absolutely critical role. But of course, 14 years, a lot can happen. So we spend a lot of time thinking about the risk mitigation within all of those contracts, and certainly we'll have clauses in there that essentially, if you have any material change in your policy framework, that you are protected. So that's the question that we always get challenged on. What happens if the SAF mandates change? And we are locked into a supply contract, particularly with the power to liquid company. So that's where that contractual structure is really, really important. And we talk to the regulators as well. The last thing we would want to see necessarily is a change in the structure of the SAF mandates, because that will significantly lessen investor confidence. That said, we also look for the regulators to display some flexibility. So, and we support both, and a lot of our SAF strategy is we're not worried about 1G SAF. We think they'll be well supplied for the foreseeable future. It is all about these advanced SAFs where there is very limited supply today. So all of our priority and focus and our long-term contracts are around supporting those types of pathways. For the conversation we're having with the EU, particularly around the eSAF mandate, we think one of the opportunities there to mitigate that risk is if they allow 2G SAF to be eligible within that 3G sub-target. We think 2G probably has got an earlier opportunity to scale. And so that's one of the things we're looking for regulators to be more flexible around the pathways to meet some of these sub-targets. And that way, we have to avoid buyout. I think everyone recognizes that buyout, this is where a supplier, the SAF supplier or fuel supplier pays a fine for not being able to meet the mandate requirement, but that cost automatically gets passed on to the airline. Everyone recognizes that is something that we all have to avoid. So flexibility from regulators and feedstock eligibility.
Thanks, Jonathan. I think that's actually a really interesting idea as well, baking in some flexibility, because it's very difficult to predict the future and how and when these next gen technologies are going to scale. Alex, do you have any comments you'd like to share?
Exercising my right to use my raise hand function until you take it away from me. Thank you. Jonathan, sorry, I'm asking you a question now. Can you talk a little bit about along what dimensions you mean flexibility is needed? Like, I find the fact that it's incredibly aligning, but also I would imagine difficult when the regulations say this technology versus, let's say, setting a carbon intensity target. Now, setting a carbon intensity target opens up other cans of worms around who's setting those parameters for what gets what, a carbon score. But would, something that is closer to a product carbon intensity be the flexibility you would need, or
it's really around feedstocks?
Or what are the other ways that it can happen?
I think it's really around, so I'll give you a couple of examples. It's really, for us, it's around feedstocks. So for instance, the EU up till now have been quite restrictive on feedstocks. And of course, we all want to avoid the sustainability challenges we saw with the first generation biodiesel. You have this food versus fuel. So we absolutely don't want to use any SAF that will take away resources that affects food production. But we think there's still a range of feedstocks that are currently or haven't been eligible that could be. So for instance, cover crops. So where cover crops in the rotational cycle, where they add back, nutrients back into the soil, they previously weren't eligible within the EU mandate. They are now eligible as a feedstock. So that gives, we think, greater opportunity to meet, particularly for us with the EU mandate. It started fairly low at 2%, jumps to 6% in 2030, but it jumps to 20% in 2035. So that's 15 million tons a year of SAF. And we think without that feedstock flexibility, as long as it's meeting those robust sustainability criteria, we think goes some way to help meeting that target. The other one, though, is power to liquids. We support power to liquids. We think they are the long-term future for meeting our 2050 targets, but we just think they're going to take longer to get there. So we have a sub-target within the EU. It starts in 2030 at 1.2%, climbs to 5% by 2035. So that's 600,000 tons a year, climbing to about 3 to 4 million tons by 2035. We don't think, even with the recent policy package that was announced, the Sustainable Transport Investment Plan, that there's going to be enough capacity to get anywhere near meeting those targets. So whereas we think 2G, so we think make that an advanced SAF target rather than just a 3G, make it a 2G and a 3G, because currently the one thing that is missing in the EU mandate is incentives for 2G SAF. So we're typically talking about alcohol to jet and municipal solid waste pathways there. There's not, which is why there's very little investment in those pathways in Europe. So we think you could kill two birds with one stone, minimize the risk of a high buyout risk with the PTL sub-target, but also create some incentives for these advanced SAFs that we think have a greater opportunity to scale earlier.
Yep, like similar to what the UK's approach is on their SAF mandate.
Exactly.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, we actually have a few minutes for some questions, and I see a few have come through. The first is specifically for Nora. Considering the need to pass on additional costs to customers, how do you assess the resilience of customers to withstand ticket price increases across different income segments?
Yeah, to answer this question, I think sort of tying together what Alex mentioned regarding carbon pricing and financial accounting, bringing it all together, carbon is a pollution. And the way to address a pollution is to internalize the externality on carbon, and that's putting a price on carbon. That is the way that our customers have demonstrated willingness to pay. We implement a carbon pricing mechanism for our customers. You put a price on carbon every time you book an air ticket, and then a fund of money is generated with each air ticket that is booked, and then customers use that fund that is generated to decarbonize those air tickets. And the way to decarbonize air tickets is to buy SAF. And our customers are buying SAF from wherever they please, primarily via airlines, and that has proven very successful. So how do our customers demonstrate resilience and withstand ticket price increases? It's by customers putting themselves in the driver's seat, analyzing their data, having a strategy, putting a price on carbon, and then going ahead and achieving their science-based and net zero targets with that carbon price. That's the way you thread carbon accounting, financial accounting, and bring it all together. And that's how you can, make your program actually achieve the targets that you've set.
Thank you, Nora. The next question, Jonathan, I think I'm going to hand to you. So what cost elements in last mile delivery justify the compliance fees that you're seeing that exceed the actual SAF market premium? And what needs to happen in the UK for the EU, in the UK and the EU, for airports to open up?
Yeah, I'd say that, I think this is referring to the IATA letter and the 50 and 70% of market price. I don't think anything justifies those price increases, which is why, I think it's down to the regulator to make sure we avoid that going forward. So transparency is really key, and that's the great role that IATA have helped provide there. And I think it comes back to book and claim, because it just at the highest level, book and claim enables you to create the most efficient and expedient supply options as the SAF market is being created. So sort of very simple example I use, say in the EU we have 5 SAF plants, we have 500 airports. The last thing you want is a mechanism that forces those 5 plants to deliver 2% SAF to 500 airports. It just doesn't make sense logistically and from a carbon point of view. So what book and claim would enable you to do is that literally each SAF plant just puts the SAF into its nearest airport. So physically you do the lowest carbon, most efficient supply routing. So each of those SAF suppliers get it into their nearest airports. So that's the physical part. And then you separate the transactional bit. The carbon accounting can be done separately so that each airport can meet its carbon requirements, and each airline can, through a transactional process, manage its compliance with the SAF. So that's what book and claim effectively enables you to do: separate the physical from the accounting transaction, so that you maximize the efficiency. And and I think the EU recognise that. They've done it for suppliers, but they haven't done it for airlines. So I think that's the next step. And I can understand they're saying, look, and I think Alex has referred to this. There is when you're setting up a new market, there is big concern around double counting for carbon reductions, and so that's what the EU are trying to as they get more confident that we have the structures and governance processes in place that we can avoid that, then I think they'll be willing to open up on that flexibility to create this and enable this efficiency.
Yeah, no, that makes sense, Jonathan. The next question I will open up to Alex and the group. Which regions are emerging as 2026 SAF hotspots? And maybe reading to this question, we've talked a lot about the UK, EU, and US, maybe looking outside those regions. Any thoughts on that, Alex, or the rest of the group?
I mean, I would defer to my colleagues on hotspots from a marketing development standpoint, but obviously I don't think we can overlook what's happening in Asia. That's Korea, China, Japan, and other countries in the region. There's a lot of reasons for that. Back to just the carbon intensity of the existing fuel mix, and as important driver back to what are we here for? I think it's meet energy demand and lower emissions. And then over time, I think I'll let my colleagues disagree or agree that these markets are going to continue to evolve, especially as other regions expand. I mean, yes, Asia, I think also probably Africa. I know maybe that's not a 2026 item, but you have to kind of keep one foot in the present and then I think one eye toward the future maybe. And so I think that's just going to be really important. Another reason for carbon accounting, but also something you asked Nora this, but I'll use my time to answer that question. I think getting the customers' inputs as much as possible really helps, I'd say, settle down the policy environment. And I think I actually hadn't heard of the Amex program, so I definitely am excited to look into that a little bit more. But anything where we can collect the data on so there's the how to use this little trade scheme, but there's also just the data around the interests. And what we find is more and more when you can get the intermediate and final customers involved. I know it's really hard, especially in regulated markets, but just get their opinions and their inputs into the process. It really helps to shape policymakers' opinions. And so how to kind of tie those things together, I think, are really important.
Thanks, Alex. The next question.
Sorry, and I agree that I think Asia, we've seen tremendous momentum in SAF production in Asia. And just a few reference points as well. We now, I think, have 12 countries that are implementing a SAF mandate. So it's interesting that you're seeing a lot of countries now, and this is the beauty of SAF. There are so many different pathways that literally every country will have a feedstock where they can produce SAF. So countries now want to get involved in being a SAF producer. Hence, and I fully expect that we'll see a proliferation of mandates. But as we say, you need more than just a mandate. You need incentives as well. So that's what we're trying to encourage. But we want to see global supply of SAF because we need to pick up fuel everywhere in the world we fly. So.
Yeah, just to put a point on that, I mean, SAF policies cover approximately 75% of fuel demand globally. So regardless of whether it's an incentive or a mandate, there is some sort of policy mechanism in place. So I think that's really positive. Of course, we wish it were all globally harmonized and the same, but alas, everything operates in a political structure, and countries need to be strategic as to what they're actually able to get over the line. But I think that top line number of 75% should give everybody a lot of confidence in the macro picture globally.
Absolutely. Well, the next question is, where are sources of seed financing for new projects outside the U.S. Coming from? And I don't know, Jonathan, if maybe you wanted to talk a little bit about this within the UK EU context.
Yeah. There's lots of funds out there. So this is a good opportunity for me to talk about the One World SAF fund that we launched 2 or 3 months ago. So we recognise that individual airlines investing in SAF plants is difficult because of the risk involved. So this is why we work with our other One World partners and with Breakthrough Energy, who we sort of recognize as probably one of the world's leading organizations in terms of understanding the SAF market landscape. So 5 One World carriers and Singapore Airlines. So it's not restrictive. It's called the One World Fund, but it's not restricted to One World carriers. It's very much an open fund, and we're looking to attract, manufacturers, SAF producers, and other airlines as well. But we had our first close in September, say $150 million. We're looking to at least triple the size of the fund, and that is there to provide early stage financing for advanced SAF projects. And we encourage others to do the same. We recognize that as an industry, we've got, as well as providing long-term committed take-or-pay offtake agreements, we have a role to help support some of these early stage technologies.
That partnership's incredible, Jonathan, especially the, way to mitigate risk and spreading that across multiple airlines, like through an alliance. The next question, maybe Nora, for you to weigh in on, what are the top 3 domestic feedstock technology pathways that can meet SAF demand in the US in the immediate future while others are being scaled up?
I think the answer is HEFA. So again, back to the SAF today versus SAF tomorrow, the only SAF that is available at commercial scale today is HEFA-based SAF. That is HEFA SAF that is made from hydroprocessed esters and fatty acids, basically fats, oils, greases, waste-based SAF. So really, that is the answer for the next 5 years, basically. That said, alcohol to jet technologies are coming online at smaller scales. So we're excited to see that happen. And Jonathan spoke extensively about the potential for power to liquids. So we need to invest in these future technologies so that they are able to scale. But the answer, for the foreseeable future is HEFA.
Yeah, and maybe if I can add to that as well. I mean, we are seeing, and we thought the power to liquid would take a few years, but there are a couple of exciting developments in the US. So the Infinium plant, Roadrunner, is approaching completion of construction. So we would look to see power to liquid fuel coming out of that plant within the next 12 months. So that's exciting. Of course, there was the very big milestone just a month ago with the LanzaJet Freedom Pines, so the first commercial scale alcohol to jet plant. So absolutely today it's all HEFA, but we're hoping that we'll start to see that ramp up of 2 and 3G to meet and driven by those sub targets within both the EU and the UK mandates.
Yeah, completely agree. The US is definitely ripe for ATJ, and it's been great to see the progress made by LanzaJet. The next question is, I think for you, Jonathan, can you speak more about how book and claim interacts with EU mandates? Could that utilize SAF that's produced in the US?
So suddenly, I mean, just to be transparent, the EU doesn't have book and claim today, and definitely when we're hoping that we will get it, as we get more confident, as I say, about those robust procedures to avoid these sort of double counting risk. So that will happen, but it will be, I think, within the European jurisdiction. But what you can do, though, so SAF produced in the US can be used to meet the requirements of the EU mandate. It just has to be shipped across to Europe. So, and we're doing that now. Yeah, so you can use US produced SAF to meet the mandate requirements, but it has to be shipped across. And to be fair, if you bulk ship, the notion that you're shipping SAF across the Atlantic, you think from a carbon point of view that's crazy, but actually it's very low. I mean, we ship jet fuel around the world, all over the world today, and actually it has a minimal impact. The UK have got they're slightly more flexible, so we can take US SAF, put it into our planes in the US, and we can claim it against the UK emissions trading scheme, which you can't do with the EU, but you can't count it against the mandate. To meet your mandate requirements, it has to be physically supplied into either the UK or Europe. I think as jurisdictions get more confident again around these robust procedures to avoid any of this fraudulent double counting, I think that could become more flexible. But as I say, in Europe, it will be within the European jurisdiction to begin with.
Thanks, Jonathan.
To on that a little bit, it may seem it's not exactly about book and claim interfacing with other markets, but it is about how book and claim is interfacing with proposed changes to the greenhouse gas protocol, and specifically some proposed changes to scope 2 emissions. And I think just the logic of book and claim, if we follow that, we want to create some flexibility to to also eliminate, or in many cases, to reduce, and in some cases eliminate the like really costly transportation component of delivering to market. And some of the changes in the proposed scope 2, which I would imagine the protocol is the basis framework for a lot of the book and claim systems, are to, I think, kind of reduce the ability to have some of that flexibility. So things like requiring electricity that's going to flow into these facilities to be new builds, requiring those new builds to be in close proximity to the offtake facility themselves. These sorts of things are in the spirit of additional precision, but when you aren't counting all emissions only once, it makes things a little bit more difficult. So, and I'm not here to talk about the protocol, but I am saying how all these things interface with each other. Like, we need just additional rationalization. And I do think, the buyers, I continue to argue, have probably all the power, if not all the power, most of the power. And so how the buyers of energy and products, and in this case, SAF, can I think help just influence kind of what happens upstream from a policy perspective, and from things like what the protocol is proposing to do is right now, similarly a call for, as Nora made, take a look at those proposed changes, and they're open for comment right now. And if the companies, I think just feel free to kind of weigh in that process, because that could be very important to how things like book and claim, input the information, because there might be new requirements around that information moving forward. Flexibility is like the buzzword.
Absolutely. Jonathan, I think another question for you. We have time for one more. Have you seen the recent policy developments in the UK and Europe having a tangible effect on the drive for SAF project development in this space, moving us towards mandates? And what will be the biggest drivers for PTL to drop in price, whether that's the price of power, DAC technology, electrolysis, or something else?
Yeah, no, we do. And it's fair to say that I think what's happening in the UK and the EU is pretty much driving the global SAF market. I think, it's great we're seeing all the producer incentives in the US, but you need the demand incentives as well, which is clearly the direction that the EU have gone. And I think, I'll come to PTL in a second. Our view is that probably the UK has got its, because of its focus on 2G rather than 3G, we think for now, that's probably the right focus. So we're very fortunate that we can see the structure. We're intimately involved in the structure of the two mandates, and which is why we're thinking great opportunity for the EU to replicate some of that. And we understand why it happened, because the EU were ahead of the UK when all the fervor was about PTL in the sort of 2015, 2020 period. Nobody's talking about 2G. Because the UK was a few years later, they had the benefit of understanding that actually this will probably scale quicker. But we think that's where that flexibility within the EU to do something about 2G, you can get the best of both worlds. And then on the other side, we think the UK needs to provide some of those additional incentives through the SAF allowances and the recycling of the EU ETS funds. That's the bit that's missing in the UK. So we just don't have enough. So we have producer incentives, but we don't have enough user incentives. So get the best of both worlds. On PTL, yeah, it's down to the access to cost-effective renewable power. Fundamentally, that's going to be 70% of the cost driver of power to liquids is that renewable energy, not least because you're essentially electrolyzing water to get the green hydrogen. So and that's why I think the companies that we're looking at, they've all got that one thing in common. They have got access to cost-effective renewable power. So you look at the Infiniums and the 12s and so on. And in Europe, there are a couple of places where that happens. It's not broad-based at the moment. And potentially here in the UK, but that seems to be the common denominator in getting FID on a power to liquid plant. Thank
you, Jonathan, for getting us in time as well. I know we got a minute left, so just big thanks to our panelists for sharing their incredible insights. And I will hand it back over to Ross.